Okay, let's unpack this. We are jumping into a work that, it fundamentally shaped Western thought, ethics, political philosophy. It's this massive, sprawling defense written at a moment of just profound civilizational crisis.
It really was.
We are diving into the first half of Augustine's monumental masterpiece, The City of God.
It's a document that was absolutely forged in fire. You have to remember, when the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, a city that had stood for 1,000 years.
The Eternal City.
The Eternal City, exactly. The shock was, well, it was seismic. Everyone from senators down to, the common folk was asking the same terrifying question, why?
And the pagans had a very quick, very easy answer.
They did. They pointed the finger directly at the Christians, saying, look, this happened because you abandoned the old gods. They are the ones who protected us, and you drove them away.
And Augustine's response, which took him something like 15 years to write.
An incredible undertaking.
And fills thousands of pages. It's basically a complete reframing of that whole crisis. So our mission today is to focus on the foundational arguments in those first several hundred pages. We're going to get into his critique of Roman religion, the origin of evil, and, this is the big one, defining the revolutionary framework of the two cities.
And you really have to start there with that conceptual split. If you want to grasp the entire text, you have to get this first. He introduces it in Book 14, and it's probably his most enduring idea.
Right.
He says the whole human race is divided, but not by borders or politics or anything like that. It's divided by two opposing principles of motivation, or as he puts it, two types of fundamental love.
And these form the two mystical cities. It's critical, like you said, that these aren't physical places.
Yeah.
He's not talking about geography.
No, not at all. It's about deep, internal, spiritual forces that are at war inside every single person. So first, you have the earthly city, the city of man.
Okay.
This city is founded by a love he calls amor sui. Self-love, yes, but specifically carried to the point where it becomes contempt for God. Its entire reason for being is the pursuit of human glory, of fame, of power. Its citizens, well, they boast in their own strength, their own achievements.
So if I'm prioritizing my reputation, my career, my own sense of autonomy above all else, even if I'm a good person by societal standards, my loyalty, in his view, is to this earthly city.
It's about placing the creature above the creator. The glory the city seeks is temporary, it's fleeting, but the chase is all-consuming. Augustine saw the Roman Republic, with its fierce ambition and its drive for domination, as the perfect example of the earthly city's pride.
And then you have the complete opposite, the celestial city.
The city of God. And this one is defined by amor Dei, the love of God. And it's a love that's carried so far that it actually reaches the point of contempt for the self.
So it's a total inversion of the first principle.
Exactly. It seeks glory only in God because it recognizes God as the source of all good. And it operates through charity, through service. Its citizens are pilgrims here. They know their true home is somewhere else.
The real genius here, though, is that he says these two cities are mixed together in the world. You can be a bishop, like Augustine himself, and still feel the pull of that amor sui, that self-love, every single day.
And you could be a pagan philosopher who, in a moment of genuine virtue, accidentally embodies the love of God. This is why the world is, in his words, mixed and confused. Empires fall, cities crumble, but this spiritual battle between these two loves, it continues inside you, inside me, inside every institution we build.
And that framework, that question of where you place your ultimate love, that's the lens he uses to analyze everything, starting with the very thing the pagans claim should have saved Rome, their religion.
Which takes us right into his relentless and honestly often hilarious demolition of Roman religion.
He dedicates a huge portion of the early books to this, just systematically tearing apart what the Romans called their civil theology.
And his big argument is that these gods were basically useless. They offered no real protection in this life and certainly no hope for the next one.
And what's so clever is how he does it. He doesn't just attack from the outside. He uses Rome's own scholarship against itself. He leans really heavily on a writer named Varro.
Marcus Terentius Varro, yeah. He was a hugely respected Roman intellectual, a polymath, and he'd written these definitive volumes on Roman life, the human and divine antiquities.
So Augustine takes this exhaustive, internally revered catalog of Roman beliefs and just turns it into a weapon.
He does. He basically says, look, your own top scholar admits your religious system has three parts. The mythical for the poets, the civil for the state, and the philosophical for the intellectuals. I'm going to show you that the first two are ridiculous, and even the third one doesn't get you where you need to go.
Okay, so let's focus on that civil theology. This was the practical, state-sponsored religion that was supposed to keep Rome safe and prosperous.
Right, and the absurdity starts right away. When Roman philosophers try to make it sound more sophisticated by unifying all the gods, they try to argue that, well, many gods are but one Jupiter.
This is their attempt to sound philosophical, right? To clean up the messy polytheism.
Exactly. To make it into a kind of pantheism. The idea was that Jupiter is the supreme soul of the world, and all the other gods are just aspects of him, or parts of nature. So Juno is the air, Neptune is the sea, Vulcan is fire, and so on.
It sounds neat on the surface, a unified field theory of the divine.
But Augustine just sees it as a total conceptual collapse. He asks, okay, if Jupiter is this single, all-powerful, supreme entity, the soul of the cosmos, how is he also responsible for tasks that are just so wildly different, and some of them, frankly, mundane?
Give us an example from the text. This part is fantastic.
He points out that Jupiter is called Tigellus, which means the one who sustains the world. Very lofty, very philosophical.
Sure.
But he's also called Ruminus, the one who gives suckle or milk to animals. Augustine basically asks, how can the supreme governing force of the universe also be the god of lactation?
It's the ultimate case of bureaucratic overload. It's like making the CEO of a global corporation also personally responsible for stocking the office break room. It just reduces the high concept to something ridiculous.
Precisely. If Jupiter is everything, the beginning, the end, war, the harvest, the arts, then the name Jupiter just becomes an empty label for everything. It ceases to mean anything specific, and it destroys the dignity of their highest god.
Which then leads him to the opposite problem, which is just as bad, the hyper-specialization of all the other gods.
Yes. If Jupiter is overloaded, the rest of the pantheon is so fragmented it's absurd. This is where Augustine's wit really comes out. He details deities with jobs so incredibly narrow they just beggar belief.
And this is my absolute favorite example, the door gods.
Oh, it's just brilliant. The theological micromanagement it's almost comical.
It really is.
Yeah.
So to guard a single door, a single entryway, you needed...
Not one god.
Not one, you needed three. You had Forculus for the doors themselves.
Right, then Cardia for the hinges.
For the hinges. And Limentinus for the threshold. And Augustine's question is just so simple, so devastatingly simple.
Couldn't one deity handle a door?
Exactly. I mean, if your divine bureaucracy is that inefficient, how can you possibly expect it to manage an empire? Imagine the god of hinges has a scheduling conflict with the god of the threshold during a siege.
The impracticality just exposes the core weakness. These gods can't handle the big picture. They're just symbols for tiny temporal functions, and it extends everywhere. You have Sagacia for the crops in the field, but Cunina for the baby in the cradle.
So what happens if there's a famine and a plague at the same time? Who do you pray to? They're totally trapped by their job descriptions.
And that leads to what I think is his final, most profound critique in this section. He talks about the delayed worship of the most important concepts of all: happiness and virtue.
He points out that Rome waited centuries to build temples to felicity, to happiness, and to virtue.
And he asks why. Because if Felicity were truly a goddess who could grant happiness, she would be the only goddess you'd ever need. Every single person is seeking happiness, right?
Of course. That's the ultimate goal.
So if you could just go to the goddess of happiness, why would you even bother with the god of doorknobs or the god of crops? If you have happiness, all the other good things follow. The fact that they added her so late proves their whole system was missing the entire point of human existence.
They were just chasing temporary fixes, better hinges, a good harvest, instead of true, lasting well-being.
It shows the spiritual vacuum at the heart of their religion. And even worse, he says, was the moral corruption. The stories of the gods, Jupiter, Venus, Mars, they were celebrated in the public theaters for their affairs, their jealousies, their deceptions.
Things, as he points out, that any decent Roman would forbid his own children from imitating.
Precisely. So the state was sponsoring the public celebration of obscenity. The gods, far from making people virtuous, were actually corrupting them, and that's his final point. Rome's internal moral ruin was already complete long before the Goths ever showed up at the gates.
That sets the stage perfectly. If these external gods can't help, Augustine has to turn inward. He has to address the foundation of all human misery, the origin of evil itself.
And this is a huge shift. We move from theology to a kind of philosophical anthropology. He has to solve that great intellectual problem. If God is perfectly good and God created everything, where did evil come from?
He starts by saying creation is perfect. God made all nature's angels humans as inherently good. So evil can't be a thing. It's not a substance, not some parallel dark force.
No, for him, evil is a privation of good. It's a not being, a non-essay. It's the only way he can maintain both God's goodness and God's power. But that leads to the really tricky part. What caused this privation?
And this is where we have to introduce one of the most important ideas in the book, the deficient cause, the causa deficiente.
Yes. Augustine argues that the origin of evil, the fall of the angels, the fall of Adam, it doesn't have an efficient cause. An efficient cause is something that actively makes something else happen, like a hammer hitting a nail.
Right.
A deficient cause is the result of a turning away, an absence. And he knows people will immediately ask, well, what made the will deficient?
And his answer is that that's the wrong question.
It's like trying to see darkness or trying to hear silence. You can't. Darkness isn't a thing. It's just the absence of light. Evil is the absence of good. It's the will turning away from the supreme being, the fullness of being, toward something lesser, toward non-being. So looking for an efficient cause of evil is, for him, a philosophical dead end.
So the cause is the act of turning away itself. But why? Why did the first man, why did the fallen angels choose to turn away from the ultimate good in the first place?
He identifies the root motive, the beginning of all sin, as pride, superbia. He calls it a perverse desire for self-exaltation. It's the soul deciding to please itself rather than sticking with the unchanging good that made it.
So pride is basically the refusal to be a creature. It's the core belief of the earthly city. I can be my own God, my own source of truth and happiness.
That's it. It's amor sui distorting itself to the point that it scorns God. And once that first spiritual turn happens, that first choice of pride, the punishment is immediate and internal. It's the civil war inside every person that he calls libido.
And we really have to clarify this for a modern audience, because when people hear libido, they just think of one thing.
Right, sexual desire. But Augustine's definition is so much broader. For him, libido is the general, shameful, disobedient movement of the body against the rational will. The mind is no longer in control.
The body is in rebellion.
Exactly. Sexual desire is just its most acute and embarrassing manifestation. But libido also includes the sudden urge to anger, the inability to control blushing or fear. It's the whole package of the body defying the mind.
The punishment fits the crime perfectly. Because the mind proudly disobeyed its creator, the body now justly disobeys the mind.
It is perfect symmetrical justice. He points to the symbolism of Adam and Eve covering themselves with fig leaves. Why did they do that? Because, for the first time, their reproductive organs moved independently of their serene, rational will. This physical shame is the immediate, tangible punishment for the spiritual shame of their disobedience.
And to show how different things were before the fall, he offers this really fascinating thought experiment.
He does. He says, look around. Even in our fallen state, some people have weird voluntary control over their bodies. Some people can sweat on command or move their ears.
Right.
So he asks, if the Creator allows for those strange powers now, isn't it perfectly logical that the first humans, in their state of perfection, could control all of their bodily functions by pure, serene, rational will, including the act of generation? It would have been as easy as deciding to lift your hand or sing a song.
No uncontrollable passion, no internal heat, no shame.
None. So our current state, this condition of libido, is constant physical proof that we've lost sovereignty over ourselves. It's a reminder that we are no longer kings in our own internal kingdom.
This internal struggle defines human life. And it leads to the next question. How does this broken humanity try to reconnect with the divine? Which means Augustine has to take on the intellectual elites, the Platonists, and their search for a true mediator.
Right. He's already taken down the popular gods. Now he goes after the high-minded philosophers. And he gives them credit. He says the best of them, the Platonists, they were way ahead of the curve. They correctly identified the one true God as the source of all happiness, the creator of everything.
So they got the big picture right. What was the problem?
The problem was the how. They felt that this supreme God was just too sublime, too perfect, too distant to have anything to do with messy, mortal human beings. So they argued that all worship, all sacrifices, should be offered to lesser intermediate beings. They called them daemons, angels, or demons, who would act as mediators.
So they created a kind of divine middle management.
Exactly, out of a kind of intellectual humility. But Augustine immediately hones in on the nature of these proposed mediators. He looks at what the Platonist writer Apuleius says about them. They're described as emotional, subject to passions, immortal, living in the air between God and man.
But Augustine asks the key moral question. What's the character of these beings? If they're supposed to lead us to a perfect God, they have to be morally perfect themselves.
And their own descriptions give them away. These demons are said to enjoy sacrilegious fictions, perverse theatrical games, and the thick vapor of sacrifices. And Augustine just asks, how can beings who delight in vice, in the very things that corrupt humanity, possibly lead anyone to a pure and perfect God?
It's a logical contradiction. You can't get to perfection by way of corruption. If these spirits love the moral filth of Roman entertainment, they can't be agents of the good.
And he contrasts them explicitly with the good angels, the true inhabitants of the celestial city.
And how do they act differently?
When good angels appear to people in Scripture, they always refuse worship. They insist that all worship and sacrifice must be given only to the one true God. They say, we're your fellow citizens, not your masters.
So the test is simple. Any spiritual being that demands worship for itself is demonic. The one that points all worship up to God is a true messenger.
It's a crucial distinction, and it leads him to completely redefine the meaning of sacrifice. If the demons love the smell of burning meat, it's because they love the material, the physical, the attention. But Augustine says that a visible sacrifice, like an animal offering, is just a sacramentum. It's a sacred sign pointing to a deeper, invisible reality.
The external act is just a symbol for an internal truth.
Yes, the only true and perfect sacrifice is the internal one. A contrite heart, a humble spirit, a self offered entirely to God. He says the true and perfect sacrifice is the self. When we live a life of charity and obedience, that is the sacrifice.
This just completely transforms religion from a transaction giving stuff to gods to get stuff back, to a total commitment of your entire being to the Creator, which of course points directly to Christ as the ultimate mediator.
Who is the singular sacrifice offered once, solving the Platonist problem by being both God and man, bridging the gap without any flawed intermediaries.
Okay, so we've got the theological framework of the two loves, the anthropological problem of pride and libido, and the right way to reconnect through true sacrifice. Now we have to come back down to earth, to the messy reality of life where these two cities are all mixed up.
Right, back to the crisis that started this whole thing, the suffering of good people during the fall of Rome. Augustine addresses this head-on. He acknowledges that in this world, the two cities are mixed and confused.
So people wanted to know, why doesn't God just reward the good people and punish the bad people right now? Why does the righteous person suffer the same fate as the wicked one when the city is sacked?
Augustine's answer is what he calls common blessings and common calamities. He reminds us that God makes the sun rise over the good and the bad and sends rain over the just and the unjust. In this life, temporal experiences, good and bad, are shared by everyone.
And he says this is on purpose.
For two reasons. First, it stops the good people from getting too attached to earthly rewards because they see wicked people getting them all the time. And second, it teaches them not to fear earthly suffering because it's just part of the deal of being human. It forces everyone to look beyond the immediate.
So the real test isn't what happens to you, it's how you react to it.
That's where his analogies are so powerful. He says the same affliction is like a crucible. The evil person protests and blasphemes. The good person prays and blesses God. It's the same fire, but it makes gold shine and straw smoke. It's the same press on the olives, but it separates the pure oil from the dregs.
This gives a profound meaning to suffering. Even when terrible things happen to Christians, they're captured, they lose everything. Augustine says it's not random.
It's a spiritual corrective. Maybe the faithful were getting too comfortable, too attached to their possessions. Maybe they were failing to speak out against the wickedness around them. The suffering forces them to get their priorities straight.
And this brings him to his final devastating point about the Romans. He says the destruction of their city didn't actually correct their vices at all.
Because the earthly city is only interested in correcting things that threaten its material survival. But its pride remains. Augustine notes with disgust that even while they were mourning the sack of their city, the survivors were flooding back into the theaters and stadiums demanding their games.
It's an incredible image. The physical walls had fallen, but their moral foundations were already in ruins, and the suffering did nothing to fix it. They learned nothing.
Their addiction to pleasure and glory was still their primary motivation, even when their glory was a smoldering ruin. That failure to be corrected by suffering is the defining mark of the earthly city.
And he uses a quote from Cicero, a Roman, to hammer the point home.
A brilliant move. He quotes Cicero saying, "Unhappy is he who is free to sin." He turns their own wisdom against them. Their real tragedy wasn't the Goths. It was their moral freedom to indulge their vices without any check, without any genuine reverence for God.
which sets up the grand finale of the work.
Yeah.
If this life is a mixed-up pilgrimage, what is the final eternal destiny that will finally separate the two cities for good?
Exactly. He moves into the deepest philosophical waters now, dealing with time and creation. He tackles that age-old question: if God is eternal and never changes, why did he decide to create the world at a specific time? Why not sooner?
It's a classic philosophical trap, right? It implies that God must have changed his mind, which would mean he's not immutable.
But Augustine sidesteps it beautifully. He says God didn't create the world with a new and sudden decision. He created it with an immutable and eternal decision. God's will to create has always existed outside of time. The fact that the creation happened in time is just part of that eternal, unchanging plan.
The timing is a mystery to us, but it doesn't imply a change in God.
And this point about linear time is absolutely crucial because it allows him to attack another popular pagan and Platonic idea: the eternal return. The belief that history just repeats in endless cycles.
Why was he so determined to refute that idea?
Because if we're all just stuck in a loop, if every life and every empire is destined to rise and fall and repeat forever, then true, lasting happiness is impossible. Nothing ultimately matters. History is just a hamster wheel.
And it would destroy the core of Christianity.
Completely. The promise of the celestial city is eternal, unrepeatable happiness. And more importantly, Christ's death and resurrection happened once. It was this singular, unique event that broke the cycle. If everything just repeats, then that ultimate act of salvation is meaningless. Our liberation has to be a new event.
The possibility of a truly final, eternal future is what gives history its meaning.
And that leads directly to the final destinies. The goal of the city of God is eternal happiness and the vision of God. That perfect, unhindered union with the Creator is the end of the pilgrimage, the ultimate satisfaction.
The cure for the deficient will that started the whole mess.
And for the wicked, the citizens of the earthly city, their final state is the second death. And he's clear, this isn't annihilation. They don't cease to exist. It's eternal misery. The soul still lives, still has sensation, but it lives forever separated from the life of God.
That separation is the death, living forever without the source of all life and goodness.
It's the permanent, unchangeable result of choosing amor sui. The earthly city, which loved its own glory, gets what it chose: eternal isolation and misery.
So this deep dive has taken us all the way from the rubble of 5th century Rome to the very foundations of human motivation and eternal destiny. We've gone from all those specialized Roman gods to the one true God, and from the cause of our misery to the hope for true happiness.
And what Augustine shows us is that the real story of history isn't about politics or battles. It's about where we place our fundamental love, our ultimate allegiance. The success of Rome was always fragile, always temporary, just a truce based on earthly needs, not true peace.
And his distinction is still so relevant. It forces you to look at your own life, our modern world, and ask, what are we building on? The fleeting glory of self-achievement, that amor sui, or on genuine service and love of the good, amor Dei.
It really makes you confront that quote from Cicero he uses. We think of tragedy as external loss, losing a job, a war, our health. But Augustine, through Cicero, suggests the deepest misfortune is internal.
Unhappy is he, Cicero exclaims, who is free to sin.
It's such a radical thought for us. We prize our freedom, our self-determination, our right to choose, even to make bad choices, above almost anything.
And call it liberty.
But Augustine suggests that that kind of unbridled moral freedom is actually the greatest danger of all. So here's the question we want to leave you with, one that comes directly out of what we've been talking about. If you could trade your freedom to choose sin, your complete self-determination, for guaranteed virtue and eternal happiness, would you? What does your answer to that question reveal about your own citizenship right now in the earthly or the celestial city? That is something truly worth thinking about.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we really commit to giving you the essential, distilled knowledge from some of the most complex and, frankly, monumental works in history.
And today is absolutely no exception. We are undertaking a massive intellectual journey. I mean, truly massive.
Massive is the word. We're diving into the central, and I mean the concluding argument of Augustine's The City of God.
That's right. We're moving beyond those initial apologies, the early parts of the book, and getting right into the philosophical and theological heart of it. We're tackling roughly the second half of the work, something like pages 484 to 966.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Augustine really transitions. He's not just defending Christianity from its critics anymore. He's actually constructing his entire worldview for us.
He is. He's laying it all out.
Yeah.
The origin of evil, the nature of sin, how he sees these two competing human societies developing. And of course, where they're headed, they're radically distinct eternal futures.
So our mission today, really, is to analyze this grand architectural feat. We're going to trace his just relentless critique of Roman civil religion, dissect his theory of the will and the origin of sin.
And then finally, we'll chart the destinations of those two great cities, the city of man and the city of God.
It's a roadmap from what he sees as petty human folly all the way to, well, an eternal cosmic destiny.
And it's so important for you to realize as you listen that the entire structure, and I mean everything from the most specific, almost funny anecdote to the most abstract theological point, it all hinges on a single brilliant thesis.
Which is?
Two foundational loves created two distinct cities. The earthly city is built on self-love, which often escalates to a contempt for God, and it's always, always seeking that fleeting human glory.
And the heavenly city.
The complete opposite. It's built on the love of God, which escalates to a contempt for self, and it's always seeking divine glory. And every single detail we explore today, whether we're talking about door hinges or the doctrine of the resurrection, it's just an illustration of these two competing desires.
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's get into it. Augustine starts by going on the offense, really tearing down the very foundation of the society he's critiquing, the whole Roman religious structure.
Exactly. We're in books 7 through 10 here, and he is just systematically dismantling the justifications for Roman paganism, or what he calls civil theology.
And the central question is so direct, isn't it? It's just, why does pagan worship fail to deliver the one thing you Romans claim you're pursuing, true eternal life?
What Augustine highlights immediately is the sheer bewildering fragmentation of their religious authority. It's just a mess. He views their religion as completely bankrupt because it shows they can't even grasp the concept of a true universal divinity.
It's a divine bureaucracy.
It is. It's a divine bureaucracy so intensely specialized that it becomes genuinely absurd.
And this is where, the humor really shines through. It might be unintended, but it's there. He's not just dismissing them, he's cataloging their deities and exposing just how redundant the whole operation is.
It's like watching a corporation hire 10 people to manage one email inbox. You just have to ask, what on earth is going on here?
Exactly.
Absolutely. He zeroes in on this hyper-division of the divine. And this is a really crucial philosophical critique that's kind of disguised as satire. The Roman deities were trapped in these tiny, minute functions.
And he points to that amazing example of the door gods.
Oh, the door gods. Think about it. They had Forculo, who presided over the doors themselves. Then they had Cardea, who looked after the hinges. And then
Limentino, who guarded the threshold.
Limentino. 3 separate deities just to manage one basic architectural component.
It suggests a stunning lack of faith in any single god's competence, doesn't it? Like, Forculo can handle the door, but hinges, whoa, that's way above his pay grade. We need to call in a specialist.
Precisely. And for Augustine, this just demonstrates a fundamental theological failure. If the supreme power is so fractured that it takes 3 separate specialized divine entities to oversee the opening and closing of a single door, how could any one of them?
Or even all of them together.
Right. How could any of them possess the universal power, the foresight, the singular authority that would be necessary to oversee something like the rise and governance of the entire Roman Empire?
They couldn't. The specialization just reduces the divine to the level of these limited, repetitive functionaries.
And he doesn't stop there. He extends this logic across the board, moving into agriculture, fertility.
Right, the sources mention Sagitia, who's in charge of the corn seed after it's planted.
And then Flora, who handles the blossoming of the plants.
And my favorite, Canina, the specific goddess of the cradle, just responsible for infants in their first few weeks.
It's a blessing bureaucracy. That's the perfect term for it. If every single stage of growth, from planting a seed to a baby's first weeks, requires a separate, specific divine intervention, then the Romans have completely lost sight of any kind of universal power.
He's using these details, these thousands of tiny, limited gods, to argue that the pagans, by fragmenting their idea of the divine, are really just revealing their inability to comprehend a singular, transcendent creator.
A creator who governs all things simultaneously, from the entire universe right down to the squeak of a hinge.
Okay, but the more sophisticated Roman thinkers, the ones Augustine calls the pagan doctors, they must have recognized this absurdity, right?
They did, to an extent. They tried to synthesize this polytheistic mess. Their common argument was that all these individual deities were just, well, aspects or functional names for one greater entity, usually Jupiter.
Jupiter. who they saw as the soul of the world.
Yes, and this is where Augustine's critique takes a really interesting philosophical turn. He starts referencing Platonic thought, which was super influential among these intellectuals. They tried to unify the chaos, but Augustine says the whole effort fails for one critical reason.
Which is?
It confuses the creator with the creation. Even if you elevate Jupiter to be the soul of the world, you are still worshiping something that is part of the world, something created, something that changes.
We're not worshiping the source.
You're not worshiping the immutable, self-existent source of all being. And that's a fundamental deviation, a mistake that keeps them spiritually grounded, preventing that necessary ascent toward the truly transcendent.
This leads perfectly into his next critique, which is about worshiping abstract concepts that the Romans turned into gods. The most powerful example being the goddess happiness, or Felicitate.
Oh, this is such a brilliant rhetorical move. Because happiness is the one thing everyone is looking for. It's the universal goal.
So Augustine poses this incredibly sharp question.
He does. He says, look, if happiness is truly a goddess and the ultimate goal of all human seeking is happiness, why would you worship anyone else? If you can get Felicitas herself, why would you waste your time offering sacrifices to the god of roads or the goddess of blossoming?
If the destination is the goal, why are you still paying homage to all the detours?
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. And he brings in a historical fact. The Romans were actually very late in building a temple specifically to happiness. It wasn't until the time of Lucullo.
Which, for Augustine, just reveals their spiritual confusion.
Completely. And he drives the point home with his conclusion. Happiness is not a goddess you worship, it's a gift of God. By worshiping the result, the gift, instead of the source, the giver, they show this profound spiritual misunderstanding.
And that's what keeps them perpetually anxious and unfulfilled.
Yes. It's such a subtle but crucial difference. It's only when you worship the source that the gifts can be truly received and appreciated. If you worship the gifts themselves, that just leads to idolatry and this endless, exhausting chase.
Okay, now we have to address his critique of the intellectuals in Book 10. I'm talking about the highly trained philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry.
Right. These were people who, at least in theory, understood the idea of a supreme, true creator. They weren't worshiping door gods.
No, but they still advocated for sacrifices and divine honors to these intermediary spirits.
They stumbled on the problem of purity. Their reasoning went something like this. The supreme God is too pure, too transcendent, and man is too impure, too burdened by the body for any kind of direct, unmediated contact.
So they needed mediators.
They needed mediators, spirits they identified as angels or demons, to basically transmit prayers upward and blessings downward, a kind of spiritual postal service.
Which introduces what you call the demonic dilemma. Augustine just uses the pagan's own sources against them here, doesn't he? He starts asking about the character of these supposed mediators.
He does. He says, just look at what these mediators enjoy. Your own sources tell us these spirits are delighted by the obscenities of the theater. They require sinister secrets of magic to be placated.
So Augustine's question is just devastatingly logical.
It is, he asks. How can mediators who revel in civic corruption, in obscenity, in forbidden magical practices possibly bring men closer to a good, pure, and holy God?
Logically, they can't. They're not bridges. They're imposters. They're impure spirits who demand material honors and want to keep humanity bound to the very corruption they pretend to mediate against.
The whole system is inverted. And this is what allows Augustine to deliver his powerful definition of true religion. He just completely rejects the physical, visible sacrifices of the pagans, the animal offerings, the material wealth, all of it.
So what is true sacrifice then, if it's not killing an animal on an altar?
He argues that God doesn't require material sacrifice because God doesn't need anything. It's a fundamental misunderstanding. The visible sacrifices that were practiced by the ancient people, he says, were just figures. They were signs sacraments meant to point toward an invisible reality.
And that reality is?
The true cult, the true devotion, what he calls religion, is the total giving of the soul to God. And this is symbolized by the contrite heart, the sacrifice of a broken and humble spirit.
So while demons are demanding external offerings because they're hungry for visible honors,
God is demanding the devotion of the interior spirit because he's seeking the soul's salvation and its ultimate purity. Augustine is essentially clearing the spiritual deck here, dismantling the entire external apparatus of Roman religion to pave the way for a completely internal spiritual foundation for his city of God.
So with that external world critiqued, even demolished, Augustine pivots into construction. He has to ask, If God created everything good, where did all this fragmentation, confusion, and spiritual disaster actually come from?
Right. We're moving into books 11, 12, and 14 now, which deal with the origin of creation and, crucially, the origin of evil.
And he starts with a huge metaphysical question, one that plagued a lot of classical thinkers.
A really big one. If God is eternal and immutable meaning, he cannot change, how can he create something new, like the world and humanity, in time without his will having changed?
Just that classic philosophical paradox. If he decided to create the world on Tuesday, what was he doing on Monday? Does that mean he changed his mind?
Exactly. It's the puzzle of time and timelessness. And Augustine's resolution is, well, I think it's elegant. He says God's plan to create the world was eternal and immutable, even though the execution of that plan happens in time.
So God didn't suddenly decide to make the world.
No. The timing of creation was woven into his timeless, unchanging design from the very beginning, from eternity. This means creation doesn't represent a change in God, but the unfolding of his unchanging will.
Okay, that makes sense. And that then leads us to the origin of sin itself, the fall of the angels, and then humanity. If everything God creates is fundamentally good, then evil can't be a created substance.
This is arguably his greatest contribution to Western theology and philosophy. It's the concept of the deficient cause of evil.
A deficient cause. Okay, break that down for us.
He sometimes calls it a decline or defexon, and it's totally distinct from an efficient cause. An efficient cause is something that actively produces a result. You know, a carpenter builds a chair. The carpenter is the efficient cause of the chair.
So a deficient cause isn't productive, it's subtractive, a turning away.
That's it, exactly. Augustine argues that evil is not a substance. It's not a thing God created, and it's certainly not some cosmic, independent force fighting God. That was the doctrine of Manichaeism, which he had to argue against forcefully.
Right.
Instead, evil is the absence of good. It's a lack, a deprivation. He uses that famous analogy. Evil is like silence or darkness. Silence is just the absence of sound. Darkness is just the absence of light. You don't need a special force or entity to create darkness. You just have to remove the light.
So the fall of an angel or a human wasn't caused by some positive force pushing them into evil. It was a voluntary turning away from the light, from the good that sustained them.
Precisely. And what drives that turning away? What's the motivation? For Augustine, it's the root of all sin. Soberba, pride.
And how does he define pride? It's more than just arrogance, right?
Much more. Pride, for Augustine, is the desire for a perverse exaltation. It's the soul trying to become its own God, its own source, its own principle. It does this by delighting too much in its own power and its own capacity, rather than remaining humbly dependent on the supreme being that gave it existence in the first place.
So the soul turns away from the greater good, which is God, toward a lesser good, which is itself.
And in that turning, it becomes disordered. That's the key.
That sets the stage perfectly for the first human transgression. In Book 14, he analyzes Adam and Eve's sin, and he really emphasizes that the problem wasn't the fruit itself.
No, not at all. The eating of the fruit was the effect of the sin, not the cause. The central issue was disobedience. And Augustine is so keen to point out that the command was easy. I mean, there was abundant fruit everywhere else in the garden.
So the transgression was all the more unjust because its observance was so easy.
Exactly. Obedience, for him, was the mother and guardian of all other virtues. By rejecting this one simple necessary submission to the Creator, they were asserting their own will above God's. That's the essence of pride.
And he makes this interesting, very specific distinction between Adam and Eve concerning their knowledge of what they were doing.
He does. He notes that Eve was deceived. She actually believed the serpent's word that they would become like gods. But Adam was not deceived. He sinned with knowledge and consciousness.
So his decision was a deliberate, willful choice. The bad will came before the bad deed.
Right. And Augustine even speculates that Adam chose to transgress out of love for his companion. He prioritized the social bond, that unity with Eve, over the direct divine command. He chose solidarity in sin over what would have been a lonely obedience and righteousness.
Which makes Adam's sin, in Augustine's eyes, a much more conscious act of that prideful will.
It does. And the consequence of this one primal act of spiritual disobedience immediately manifests itself physically in humanity forever after. And that's the origin of libido.
This is such a critical concept, and his analysis is surprisingly detailed and, well, psychological.
It's the heart of the punishment. It's the visible scar of the fall. And it's so important to understand that libido here isn't just sexual desire. It's disorderly desire in general. It's the soul's comprehensive loss of control over the body.
He connects the dots perfectly.
Yeah.
The soul chose to disobey God.
So As a just punishment, the body now disobeys the soul.
The body revolts against the mind.
Exactly. The involuntary, unruly movement of the generative organs, what the sources call the stormy ardor, that's the ultimate physical sign that the soul is no longer fully in command.
And he speculates that before the fall, in paradise,
Before the fall, he imagines that all bodily functions, including generation, would have been controlled purely by rational will. It would have been as easy and as passionless as moving your arm. There would have been no shame, no involuntary passion, none of it.
so the blush, the shame, the need for covering up, that's all physical evidence of a spiritual contract being broken. Man was abandoned to himself because he abandoned God.
It is the deepest form of poetic justice you can imagine. You wanted to rule yourself apart from God. Fine. Now your own body, the thing that's closest to you, is going to revolt against your rational will. The shame we feel is the recognition of this internal civil war.
And this foundational concept, this internal division caused by the original sin, this is what allows Augustine to definitively establish the foundations of the two cities.
Yes. The two loves, now irrevocably marked by the fall, create the two distinct destinies for all of humanity.
And the division is absolute.
Completely. The earthly city, the Civitate Dei, is rooted in the love of self, which is carried to the point of contempt for God. It's always seeking the recognition and glory of other men.
And the heavenly city, the Civitate Dei.
It's founded on the love of God, carried to the point of contempt for self. It seeks only the glory of God. These are the two spiritual trajectories, and it's all based on where the will is fundamentally aimed.
And these two cities are instantly prefigured by the first two brothers, Cain and Abel.
It's the perfect illustration. Cain is the founder of the earthly city. His city is built on fratricide, on jealousy, and on the anxiety of trying to make an earthly name for himself.
Right.
He built physical structures. He was driven by material possession.
Whereas Abel, the shepherd, built nothing permanent.
He built no permanent structures, which signifies the temporary pilgrim nature of the city of God here on earth. And the key is that they are constantly intertwined throughout history. They coexist in the same political spaces, same geographical areas, but spiritually they are moving in completely opposite directions.
So as these two cities develop side by side, sharing the same geopolitical space, they must often be difficult to distinguish from the outside.
They are, and Augustine tackles this confusion directly by discussing the concept of common goods and evils. We might call it shared experience or even common grace.
This must have been a crucial point for his audience. I mean, Romans were suffering through economic hardship, political chaos.
Exactly. People were asking, if I am righteous, why am I suffering through this war or this plague or this poverty, just like my wicked neighbor? Augustine has to address the fact that temporary goods and evils, prosperity, success, military victory, or famine and disaster, are universally applied to both the good and the wicked.
So how does he reconcile this reality that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike with the idea of a sovereign, just God?
He outlines two really powerful reasons for this divine impartiality when it comes to temporal or earthly affairs. First, God ensures that the righteous are not seduced by these temporary goods.
Okay, how so?
Well, if only the good were prosperous and successful, then prosperity itself would become the ultimate spiritual marker. Wealth would become an idol they chased. By allowing the wicked to be prosperous too, it strips those temporal goods of their ultimate spiritual importance.
It detaches the idea of earthly success from eternal salvation. It keeps your eyes on the real prize.
Precisely. And the second reason is that suffering serves as a mechanism. It refines the righteous, and he says it might potentially move the wicked to repentance. Prosperity often softens the soul, adversity tests it, and strengthens it.
And he uses that incredibly relatable analogy, the refining process, to illustrate this distinction.
Yes, the same suffering, the same flame, the same press. It acts differently depending on the material it's working on. The flame refines gold, right? It strips away the impurities, makes it stronger and purer.
But that same flame completely consumes straw and dregs, leaving nothing behind.
Exactly. So the key distinction, Augustine insists, is not what one suffers, but how one suffers. The external event is the same for both people, but the internal reaction and the purpose it serves determines whether it's a salvific experience or a destructive one.
Now, shifting to historical examples, Augustine shows the consequences of the earthly city's pride in these grand, visible terms. He starts with the story of the Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel is just the perfect historical manifestation of that spiritual flaw that was introduced by pride. It was built out of the ambition to make a name for themselves and create a structure whose top may reach heaven.
That's the very definition of perverse exaltation, of self-glory seeking.
It is. And God's immediate punishment was the confusion of tongues.
So the scattering of the nations and the linguistic confusion, that's the physical and social manifestation of their spiritual confusion and their prideful desire for self-sufficiency.
That's it. The result of their attempt to unify themselves under a banner of human pride was fragmentation and incomprehension. It's a powerful lesson that any attempt to build a lasting, unified human order apart from God is just doomed to result in chaos and division.
But Augustine doesn't just focus on ancient scripture. He turns his harshest critique on contemporary Rome. I mean, he was writing this right after the traumatic sack of the city.
And he's just appalled by the cultural rot that had infected the Roman people, even in the face of such devastation.
He describes it as sheer lunacy.
It was. Immediately following the destruction and the upheaval of the city, the Roman populace rushed back to the theaters and the public games, demanding their entertainment. They hadn't learned a single lesson from the calamity.
It's incredible.
He recalls the ancient statesman Scipio Africanus, who had feared that prosperity would lead to Rome's corruption. And Augustine just wryly observes that adversity found the Romans completely incorrigible.
They were so morally bankrupt that the destruction of their city only made them demand more trivial entertainment. It's a shocking picture.
It really speaks to the depth of their moral collapse, and it leads to that powerful, sobering reflection. The walls stand, but the customs are ruined. The visible physical structures of the city might survive the barbarian invasions, but the invisible moral foundation has already collapsed from within.
That feels like a profoundly relevant warning for any society that prioritizes spectacle and pleasure over virtue and reflection, doesn't it?
It really does. It's timeless.
Okay, from there, Augustine moves to another intensely practical and radical philosophical point, his absolute prohibition against suicide. This was a really big deal because for many Romans, suicide was a point of honor, especially if they were captured or faced disgrace.
This was a major ethical debate in the late Roman world, and Augustine is completely unequivocal. The commandment, "You shall not murder," applies to the self. Suicide is self-murder, full stop.
And he addresses these common scenarios, like women who considered suicide to avoid being raped during captivity, believing that death was preferable to dishonor.
He does, and he argues that avoiding the sin of others, or even a perceived future disgrace, does not justify committing the definitive, immediate sin of homicide against oneself. The soul's purity, he argues, isn't violated by an act committed against the body without the will's consent.
But what's the deepest, most theological logic for this absolute prohibition, particularly if someone is thinking of committing suicide to avoid a future? Greater sin like maybe consenting to lust under pressure or abandoning their faith?
This is where his focus on repentance is just so key. Augustine establishes this stark hierarchy of certainties versus possibilities. It is insane, he says, to choose the certainty of homicide, a sin that immediately ends your life and therefore defiantly cuts off any possibility of repentance.
Over the uncertainty of a future sin.
Exactly, a future sin which, even if it were committed, penitence could still cure.
That's a fundamental theological distinction. Suicide is, by its very definition, an unrepented sin.
By its nature, it shows an ultimate lack of trust in God's ability to sustain the soul through suffering. The Christian soul, he argues, has to possess confidence and hope in divine wisdom. It has to trust that God will provide the strength to endure temporary suffering or even disgrace, rather than choosing an immediate, definitive, and unrepentable crime against the person God created.
So he reframes suicide completely. It's not about honor or desperation anymore.
No, he reframes it as a profound act of pride and ultimate distrust in God.
Wow. Okay, so now we arrive at the culmination of the entire work, the final destiny for both the city of God and the city of man. But Augustine first has to spend some time combating these philosophical ideas that challenged the Christian vision of eternity.
Right. The biggest challenge came from certain Platonic schools who held to this notion of eternal circuits or cyclical recurrence.
Okay, what did that involve?
This worldview basically said that souls were perpetually recycled. They ascend to some temporary bliss, then they inevitably decline back into misery, only to be recycled again and again and again. It completely denied the linearity of history and the permanence of salvation.
It just sounds exhausting. An endless loop of effort and failure.
It is. And Augustine rejects it vehemently. He finds it impossible to reconcile with the Christian narrative, where history is actually moving toward a definitive climax, not just going around in circles.
And his ultimate counter-argument against this philosophical trap, what's the linchpin?
It's the unique, unrepeatable event of the incarnation and sacrifice of Christ. Precisely. Christ died once for our sins, not in a recurring cycle. So, if the sacrificial act that secures our salvation is unique and finite, then the salvation it offers must be eternal and final. Our future happiness, Augustine insists, will have no end. And that certainty just fundamentally shatters the philosophical idea that misery has to inevitably return.
So the city of God is heading toward a definitive, non-cyclical, permanent home.
Exactly. The ride doesn't start over.
So with the eternal nature of salvation established, he then has to tackle the nature of the physical body in the next life. He's specifically countering those wise of the world who mocked the very idea of resurrecting earthly bodies.
Right, the common objection was very practical. How can a heavy, corruptible body of flesh and blood ascend to a celestial realm? How can bones and organs be immortal? It seems ridiculous on its face.
And Augustine's solution is transformation, not replacement.
That's the key. He insists the body will retain its identity. It will be the same substance, you will still be you, but it will be radically transformed into what he calls the spiritual body.
Identity retained, but the properties are changed. It's like upgrading the software on the same hardware.
That's a great analogy. The body will be freed from corruptibility, from weight, so it can move instantaneously, and, crucially, from the capacity for any further sin or disorderly desire.
So no more libido.
No more libido. It will become immortal, much like the angels, and the soul will have absolute perfect command over it once again. It fulfills the original intent of paradise before the fall. That internal civil war, the constant fight between the mind and the body, will finally cease.
Then, on the darker side of destiny, Augustine has to address the logic of eternal punishment, the doctrine of eternal torment, and the crucial question: how can bodies live perpetually in fire?
This is a complex theological defense, and Augustine really relies solely on the argument of divine omnipotence. He cites both nature and miracles. He basically says, look at the world around you. God has already created things that can resist extreme conditions, certain minerals, or even natural phenomena that are endlessly regenerative.
He even references the myth of the phoenix, right?
He does. He brings up the popular myth of the phoenix bird, which perpetually renews itself in fire, as an example that his audience would understand.
So his logic is, if God can make a stone resistant to fire through natural laws, he can certainly make a human body resistant to dissolution by fire through divine will.
That's the core of the argument. Augustine concludes that God's omnipotence ensures that the bodies of the impious will be specially constituted to live and feel pain eternally in the fire, as a just and defined punishment for their final impenitence.
So the pain is eternal because the sin was against the eternal majesty of God.
And the body's life is sustained not by its own nature, but by the direct will of the Creator. It's a purely theological defense of infinite duration.
And so finally, we reach the ultimate positive end for the city of God: the perpetual Sabbath.
This is it. The cessation of all labor, all struggle, all anxiety. It's the ultimate rest. And this state is defined by one thing: the beatific vision of God, the direct, immediate, immutable knowledge of the Creator. In this state, God is all in all things.
So if the entire journey of the city of God was defined by that love of God, carried to the point of contempt for self, that desire for God's glory above all else, this vision has to represent total and final fulfillment.
It does. There's no more seeking, there's no more faith needed, because there's only certain knowledge, there's no more suffering, and there's no possibility of sin. It is a state of perpetual rest, love, and intellectual satisfaction. It's the destination where the will, having been disordered by pride, is finally and eternally aligned with the immutable good.
It's an overwhelming, monumental conclusion that ties everything together. The philosophical failure of the pagans, the metaphysical origin of evil, the physical consequences of sin, and the historical struggle of the two cities.
And the success of the work, the reason it's so enduring, is how Augustine successfully weaves all of human history and destiny, secular and sacred, into a single coherent and morally driven narrative. The entire cosmos makes sense through the lens of those two foundational loves.
So after all that, what does this complex theological architecture mean for us? For the learner steeped in the modern world, Augustine concludes his massive work with this really potent reflection on human will and true happiness.
He brings it right back to the beginning, to the original temptation. The first man desired to live according to his own will, or as Augustine phrases it, if he lived according to his will, he would judge himself happy. In reality, however, he would not be if he lived basely.
The deepest irony of the fall is that in attempting to achieve absolute freedom by disobeying God, Adam immediately lost control over his own self.
Right. The deepest misery is wanting to live by your own will, but failing to control your own body. You want freedom, but you end up a slave to your own passions.
The ultimate freedom, then, must be found in surrendering the very control we desire so much.
It has to be. It lies in aligning your will with the eternal, immutable plan of the Creator. Augustine forces us, even now, to confront the source of our own internal disorder, our daily frustrations, our persistent disorderly desires, our libido in its broadest sense.
And if that internal chaos is just the penalty for that original prideful turn away from the immutable good,
Then the only path back to peace is through a radical submission of the will, and that is the final, profound challenge from the end of the city of God.
so the provocative thought he leaves us with is this.
What would it genuinely mean for your daily choices, for your goals, for your ultimate sense of happiness, if you only wanted what God willed? That is the question Augustine leaves ringing in our ears. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on, well, a truly colossal task. We're navigating the intellectual landscape of one of the most important books ever written.
We are.
We are diving into Augustine of Hippo's defining work, The City of God.
It's an overwhelming task,
Yeah.
but a necessary one, I think. You have to remember the context. Augustine wrote this right after the sack of Rome in 410 AD.
A total cultural catastrophe.
It shattered the Roman psyche. And immediately, the pagans started blaming Christianity. They were saying, the old gods are offended, that's why the empire's falling.
So Augustine's response, this massive 22-book work, wasn't just a defense.
Oh, no, not at all. It was a declaration. He was arguing that Christianity offered a superior and an eternal system that could replace the old one entirely.
And our mission today is really focused on this crucial middle section of the work. We're looking at, roughly pages 967 through 1449 of the complete text.
Right.
And this is where Augustine just completely shifts gears. He stops dealing with the immediate crisis and starts building his eternal city.
It's a huge transition from history and apologetics into really deep philosophy and theology. Our goal is to unpack his methodical destruction of the old religious structures, what he calls the city of man, and then trace the theological foundation of his city of God.
From the very beginning.
From creation itself, through the mystery of human sin, and all the way up to our final eternal destiny.
We're looking for those critical aha moments, the conceptual clarity, those striking analogies that make a 5th century text suddenly feel so immediate.
In the underlying structure.
Right, the structure that allowed him to perform what was really a complete system overhaul for Western thought. It's a journey that literally goes from arguing about gods for door hinges, all the way to defining the nature of free will and original sin.
And that contrast is exactly why this section is so compelling. He's presenting this unified, rational, and morally coherent worldview as a direct replacement for what he's about to show is, a fragmented, superstitious, and frankly, morally bankrupt civil religion.
Okay, so let's start there. With that demolition project, Augustine dedicates a huge amount of space, especially in Book 4, to just exposing the functional absurdity of Roman polytheism.
He focuses on what the Romans called civil theology.
The state religion.
Exactly, the one that was supposed to secure Rome's prosperity. And he argues that it was just structurally unsound. And to prove it, he leans heavily on the work of the Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro.
Who was himself a pagan.
Right. Varro was trying to document and preserve Roman religious life, and in doing so, he basically handed Augustine the perfect weapon for his critique.
It's this problem of hyper-specialization, right? Like taken to this almost ludicrous extreme. If you have a god for every little thing, you ultimately have a god for nothing.
That's his point. Augustine frames this specialization not as, being thorough, but as proof of a profound spiritual confusion and inefficiency.
It's less like a divine government and more like a micromanagement disaster.
That's a perfect way to put it. Augustine just points out the sheer volume of these minor deities assigned to the most mundane, everyday processes of life. It just illustrates this total fragmentation of divine power.
So give us some of the most striking, they're almost humorous examples of this.
Well, the most famous one, of course, is the door.
The door.
Just to manage the simple process of opening and closing a single door, Varro's catalog lists 3 separate deities. Three. You have Forculus, who's the god of the door panel itself. You have Cardia, the goddess of the hinges. And then you have Lemontinus, the god of the threshold.
Wait. The hinges have their own goddess.
They do. And Augustine just jumps on this. He asks the obvious question. Why do you need 3 gods for one entryway? Is divine authority spread so thin that the hinge needs its own dedicated celestial manager.
3 managers for 1 door. I mean, that sounds less like a pantheon and more like a bureaucratic nightmare just waiting for a turf war.
And it gets even more specific, especially when you look at agriculture or early childhood. You've got the goddess Kunina watching over the baby's cradle, the god Dudas for the knots in the wheat stalks.
The knots in the stalks.
Yes, and rumina, or ruminus for suckling animals. Augustine's point is just devastatingly simple. If the ultimate goal of your religion is prosperity and eternal life, how can these gods possibly offer you that? Their entire attention is confined to these tiny temporal functions. They can't oversee an empire, let alone the cosmos.
So that's the, let's call it the plebeian level. But what about the more intellectually sophisticated Romans, the philosophical elite? How did they try to justify this system?
Oh, they knew it was a problem. The educated pagans, especially the ones influenced by Platonism, they tried to rationalize the whole thing. They suggested that all these little specialized gods were really just aspects or powers.
Flowing from a single source.
Exactly. Flowing from one supreme being, usually Jupiter, who they often identified with the soul of the world. It was their way of trying to get to a kind of monotheism.
Which you'd think Augustine would have some sympathy for. The idea of a single supreme power.
He accepts the logic, of course.
Yeah.
But he rejects the practice. He draws a very sharp line at the act of worship.
What he calls latria.
Right. The highest form of religious service, which he says is due only to the Creator. Augustine argues that even if their philosophy led them to a supreme Jupiter, their actual religious practice still demanded they give divine honors and sacrifices to created things.
The sun, the moon.
The sun, the moon, the earth, and all these little functionaries. And for him, that is spiritual idolatry. They failed to elevate their devotion from the created thing back to the uncreated source.
And that failure of intellect sets up his next line of attack, which is, I think, even more powerful. He moves from intellectual confusion to undeniable moral failure.
This is in Book 2, and it's absolutely devastating.
The Roman gods weren't just bad administrators. He says they were ethically toxic.
His most potent piece of evidence here is the complete absence of any moral instruction. He notes very pointedly that the Roman gods, for all their demands for rituals and sacrifices, never established any clear doctrine against greed or lust or ambition.
They only cared about rituals for earthly gain.
Rituals for temporary earthly gain. Nothing about how to live a good life or secure an eternal one.
And the most damning evidence he presents for their moral bankruptcy comes directly from the Roman stage, the theatrical games.
This is where his argument becomes, I think, irreversible. Augustine says the gods didn't just, permit immoral activities to happen. They actively demanded them.
Demanded them.
As part of their sacred worship, their cultus. He points specifically to the scenic games, the ludi scenici, which featured just explicit moral depravity and indecent acts right there on stage.
So it's a fundamental inversion. The gods weren't protectors of virtue. They were actually sponsors of vice.
Absolutely. Augustine argues that these performances were demanded by wicked spirits, demons, who just reveled in the moral turpitude being displayed. This was their spiritual feast. He frames the whole thing as an offering.
But instead of offering food or animals,
the Romans were offering food to the hunger of demons. They were feeding their lust for human corruption.
And the historical context here is so important. Augustine writes that even as the city was literally facing collapse during the invasions, the Roman citizens were still prioritizing running to the theaters.
The moral rot was so deep, it actually superseded their survival instinct.
It's incredible.
And this leads Augustine to bring up that old warning from Scipio Aemilianus, the general who sacked Carthage. Scipio's real worry wasn't an external enemy.
No.
He was afraid that prosperity would corrupt Rome far more effectively than any enemy army could destroy it. He reportedly said he preferred for the walls of Rome to stand, but for its customs to be in ruins.
That quote just resonates so powerfully today, doesn't it? I mean, we spend so much energy on physical and economic infrastructure, but Augustine, through Scipio, is forcing us to confront that internal moral decay is the far greater threat.
The failure is structural. It's spiritual.
Yeah.
Augustine concludes that these false gods, these demons, only care about temporary physical things because that's all they can offer. They don't have the authority or the desire to guide humanity toward true, lasting happiness.
And he also highlights this profound inconsistency in the pantheon itself, with the deified abstractions. If the Romans were so committed to turning virtues into gods, why were they so selective about it?
It was a selection process dictated by political convenience, not by any real piety. That's his argument. For example, he asks, why did they wait so long until the general Lucullus came back with his spoils to finally build a temple to Civitate to happiness?
Right. If happiness is the goal of all human action, it should have been the first temple built.
By Romulus himself. If Rome was truly about human flourishing. But Augustine goes deeper. He says true happiness isn't a goddess you worship. It's a gift from God.
To worship the quality is to miss the giver.
Precisely. It's a fundamental intellectual error. And their choice of other deified virtues is just as revealing. They built temples to virtue and faith.
Qualities you need for the army, for loyalty, for the political machine.
Exactly. But then Augustine asks the killer question. If you have temples to virtue and faith, why did you leave out temperance and prudence?
Those are crucial virtues for personal stability, but maybe less useful for, rallying the troops.
That's his point. The four cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. By worshiping only the ones useful for political dominance and military strength, virtue, which is fortitude, and faith, while ignoring the ones that curb personal excess and foster reflection, they just proved their focus was on human glory and earthly conquest.
They proved they were citizens of the city of man.
They sought temporary advantage, not eternal truth.
So Augustine's critique of paganism really serves as this necessary negative space. Once he's proven the old system fails, morally and philosophically, he has to provide the positive foundation for the city of God.
Right.
And that brings us to Book 14 and his explanation for the origin of human brokenness, the nature of the first sin.
And this is where he performs one of his greatest philosophical achievements. He has to define sin not just as, a mistake or a symbolic act, but as a fundamental rupture in the order of creation. He has to move the conversation away from just the simple act of eating an apple.
So the sin wasn't really the eating of the fruit itself. It was the motivation behind it. It was disobedience and, most importantly, pride.
Pride, soberba, is the foundation of all evil for Augustine. He defines it as the appetite for perverse exaltation. It's the desire of the human spirit to become its own principle, to stand on its own.
To live secundum se.
According to themselves. They chose to abandon the immutable good, which is God. And the command was so simple precisely to magnify the gravity of that choice. They chose self over the source of their own being.
Which leads us into this very complex but absolutely foundational concept, the deficient cause of evil. This is crucial for defending God's goodness, isn't it?
This is the core philosophical system overhaul. You have to remember, Augustine had spent years as a Manichaean.
Right, the dualistic system.
Where evil was a substance, an active, co-eternal force fighting against God, who was goodness. But if evil is a substance, that means either God created it or he's not all-powerful. Augustine's solution is the deficient cause.
So if God is the efficient cause, the one who creates all good things, what exactly is a deficient cause?
It's not a cause that creates something. It's a cause that fails to sustain something. The cause of the evil will, the malevoluntas, is a deflection. It's a declining defexum from the supreme being. Evil is not a positive substance.
It's the absence of good.
It is the privatio boni, the privation of good.
We really struggle with that, I think, because we tend to think of everything as a positive existence. We think of light and darkness as two different things.
And Augustine forces us to see that darkness is simply the absence of light. That's why he says the origin of the evil will is, in a way, unknowable.
How so?
He uses these wonderful sensory analogies. He says, seeking the causes of such defects is like trying to see darkness or hear silence.
Wow.
You only know darkness by the absence of light. You don't know it by its own positive properties. In the same way, the will, by turning away from God, the supreme being, becomes deficient. It loses the good it was given. It doesn't become something new and evil. It becomes less.
And the moment that internal order is broken by pride, the punishment is immediate and just perfectly fitting. What was the consequence of this turning inward?
The consequence was a total reversal of the divinely established hierarchy within the human person. Man was created to be spiritual even in his flesh.
Meaning the body obeyed the soul.
Perfectly. And the soul was perfectly obedient to God. But once the soul revolted against God, the body justly revolted against the soul. Man became, as he says, carnal even in his mind, delivered to this miserable servitude.
And the most immediate, the most visceral evidence of this servitude, this internal rebellion, is the unruly nature of libido. He goes into this in incredible detail.
Libido, which we can translate as lust or concupiscence, is so crucial here. Augustine argues it's not an inherent part of human nature as God designed it. It's a vice, a vidium, And it's the direct penalty for that first disobedience.
That's the proof.
It's the visible proof that the soul has lost absolute command over its own body.
He focuses so much on the feeling of shame, pudor, and the need to cover what he calls the shameful parts. Why are the generative organs so central to his whole argument about the fall?
Because they're the physical manifestation of this disunity. Augustine asks this very direct question. Why can we move our hand or our foot by a simple conscious act of will, but the generative organs, which are designed for the holy act of procreation, now move disobediently?
Right.
They often require the stormy ardor tempestuoso, that just arises independent of our rational decision.
So the body itself is defying the rational will. It's mirroring the soul's defiance of God's will.
It's a perfect, self-inflicted cosmic justice. The body is literally acting like a slave who refuses the master's command. And this leads him to this really remarkable theological speculation.
Could generation have happened without libido in paradise?
Exactly. And the wisdom of the time, even for some Christians, might have been to just avoid the question.
But Augustine dives right in.
His answer is a powerful affirmation of original human perfection. He says, yes, absolutely. Generation would have occurred without lust. The generative organs would have been controlled by the will, just like hands or feet, purely for the function of procreation.
Without the shame or the uncontrollable passion.
Exactly. And this just highlights how radical and disruptive the shift in human nature was after the fall.
And this detailed focus on shame, it also allows him to address and refute those who claim to be, I guess, returning to a natural state like the Cynic philosophers.
Oh yes, the Cynics. They famously practiced public indecency, arguing they were showing true philosophical virtue by rejecting social convention.
They were just being natural.
And Augustine just dismisses them out of hand. He argues that covering the shameful parts is not just some social convention that was invented later. He says it is a natural, God-instilled recognition of the body's disobedient state after the fall.
So, in other words, the shame is the symptom of the sickness, not the sickness itself. The Cynics were just flaunting the wound.
Precisely. The need to cover these parts is a testament to the internal conflict, a conflict that exists even within the sanctity of the marriage bed. He uses this deep dive into human physiology and psychology to really solidify the doctrine of original sin as a total, comprehensive corruption inherited by all of us. And it's the necessary bridge to understanding why humanity needs a city of God defined by divine grace.
Okay, so with the origin of sin now established, Augustine provides the essential framework for understanding all of human history and society.
Right.
This brings us to the famous definition of the two cities, the city of God and the city of man, which he lays out in books 14 and 15.
This really is the centerpiece of the entire work. He needed a structure that could transcend geography, politics, historical eras, and he provides it in the most fundamental way possible. He defines the two cities by two contrary loves.
Let's nail those definitions down because they are so often misunderstood as, literal places on a map.
Okay, so the first one, the city of man, which he often equates with earthly kingdoms and their pursuits. It's founded by the love of self, which extends even to the contempt of God.
Amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei.
Exactly. The ultimate expression of self-idolatry, the spirit of that original prideful choice.
And the city of God.
The heavenly city is founded by the love of God, which extends even to the contempt of self. Amor dui usque ad contemptum sui. So the earthly city glories in itself and seeks fleeting human glory. The heavenly city glories only in God and seeks true eternal peace.
And the critical clarification here, which even people in his own time often missed, is that these two cities are not separate, visible political entities right now.
No, absolutely not. Augustine is explicit about this. He says they are mixed and confused in this temporal age.
You can't draw a map and say, this kingdom is the city of God and that one's the city of man.
No. They're interwoven, like wheat and chaff in a field. They share the same physical space, they experience the same temporal events, but they are driven by two distinct, mutually exclusive loves toward two different ends. The physical separation only happens at the final judgment.
And Augustine traces the beginnings of this rivalry, this mixing, all the way back to the very first generation of humanity.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel.
Cain is the first to build a city, which Augustine symbolically links to Babylon or confusio, confusion. Cain is the founder of the earthly city, and his defining act, murdering his brother, Abel.
Right.
It demonstrates that the city of man is characterized from its very beginning by violence, envy, and the desire for singular self-serving power. Abel, meanwhile, is the pilgrim, the sojourner, who has no earthly city because he's seeking the heavenly homeland.
And this historical tracing allows Augustine to tackle that major pagan challenge. This idea that imperial success equals divine favor. Rome is flourishing, so the gods must be pleased.
He completely dismantles that by reaffirming the absolute impartiality of God's universal providence. He argues that God distributes earthly kingdoms and temporal goods, success, wealth, peace, to both good and bad rulers.
To the righteous and the wicked alike.
And this success is not random fate, non fortuna, but it follows a sovereign, immutable order that is known only to him.
That is such a profound shift in worldview. It completely divorces the spiritual meaning of a person's life from their material success, something we still struggle with so much today.
It's the ultimate counterpoint to the transactional religion of Rome. Augustine quotes the Bible. God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous.
Temporal goods and evils are common to both citizenships.
And this parity is intentional. He says if God only rewarded the good with prosperity in this life, people would seek him out of greed, not out of true piety. So God allows the wicked to thrive and the good to suffer precisely to refine virtue and ensure worship is directed toward eternal truths, not earthly rewards.
And Book 15 goes into some fascinating details of early history that would have really preoccupied his readers, things like the immense longevity of the antediluvian men and the question of giants.
He's very meticulous. He addresses the physical accounts, even from poets like Virgil, about the large stature of bodies in the early ages. He even mentions having personally seen a human molar on the shore near Utica that was so large, you might imagine it belonged to a giant.
So he doesn't dismiss these things.
No. But he frames them as historical curiosities that, whether they're true or exaggerated, don't change the divine narrative of creation and fall. The physical world, no matter how strange, always yields to the supreme logic of God's plan.
And the Tower of Babel is presented as another confirmation of the city of man's spirit and trajectory.
Yes. Babel, or confusio, confusion, is another physical manifestation of that pride, that soberba. The people, unified by a single language, try to use their collective human power to reach the heavens on their own terms.
Bypassing God.
And what's the result of this human-centered ambition? Fragmentation, confusion of languages. It's the inevitable outcome of self-glory and contempt of God. It leads only to division, strife, and miscommunication, confirming the essence of the earthly city.
Okay, let's ascend now to the deepest theological and spiritual material in Book 10, where Augustine really addresses the nature of true worship, the role of spiritual beings, and the path to real happiness. He has to confront and dismantle the very sophisticated philosophical systems that rivaled Christianity, especially Neoplatonism.
The central philosophical hurdle here is the problem of mediation.
Right.
If, as the Platonists sought, the supreme God is utterly transcendent and pure, and man is impure, how does the imperfect soul even communicate with the perfect God? The philosopher Apuleius proposed that demons served as necessary messengers, filling that intermediary gap.
But Apuleius meant demons in the more neutral Greek sense of just spiritual beings. Augustine makes a very definitive theological statement about their actual character.
He absolutely rejects their neutrality. He argues forcefully that these are not pure messengers. They're deeply flawed, subject to violent passions, and are fundamentally wicked spirits. And their true spiritual nature is revealed in their actions.
In what they enjoy.
In what they enjoy and what they demand. They delight in the moral filth of the theater, and they insist on the practice of destructive magic, or teregia, for their worship.
So if they're corrupt, they can't possibly mediate purity.
Exactly. They seek worship for themselves. They demand sacrifices. And Augustine clarifies that the highest form of religious service, latria, is due only to the Creator. The only truly pure sacrifice is internal. A contrite heart, the total dedication of oneself to God.
So visible sacrifices are just signs.
They are merely sacraments, outward signs, signa, of that invisible internal dedication. By demanding sacrifices that are meant only for God, the demons reveal their profound malice and pride.
And he contrasts this directly with the behavior of the good angels.
The difference is night and day. When good angels appear to men in the scriptures, they invariably refuse all worship. They consistently redirect it only to God. They act as ministers, pointing men back to the Creator. The question Augustine poses is simple. How can beings who delight in immoral plays and seek worship for themselves mediate anything pure? The whole idea just collapses.
And moving beyond spiritual beings, he has to defend the very act of creation itself against philosophical critique, specifically addressing the mystery of God's immutable will operating in time. This is in Book 11.
This is a classic philosophical riddle. If God is eternal and perfect, why did he wait an infinite amount of time before creating the world?
The critique is that creating the world implies a change in God's plan, that at some point he suddenly decided, okay, now I'll create.
Which would imply God isn't immutable, or that he somehow improved his own plan over time. Augustine's answer preserves God's timelessness. He asserts that God's will is eternal and absolutely unchanging. He didn't suddenly decide to create time. He eternally intended to create things in time.
So the temporal action doesn't imply a change in his eternal intention.
Exactly. It's an impenetrable mystery to our finite minds, but it's logically necessary for the concept of an unchanging creator who is the source of all change and time itself.
And this whole discussion of time then directly sets up Augustine's massive philosophical battle against the concept of cyclical time, the doctrine of the eternal return.
This was a deeply entrenched idea, rooted in Stoic and Platonic thought. The circuitous imaginarii, the imaginary circuits, the idea that time repeats itself infinitely. Everything that happens now has happened before and will happen again.
Why was that idea so appealing to the ancients?
For a few reasons. Philosophically, it provided a sort of comforting sense of cosmic order and necessity. History was logically determined. For the Platonists, it linked time to the perfection of circular motion. If the cosmos is perfect, it must move in a perfect circle, which means everything must inevitably return to its starting point.
But Augustine calls this doctrine impious. That's a very strong denouncement. What's the fundamental danger of the eternal return?
It completely negates the meaning of Christian redemption and the security of final happiness. If everything repeats, then the final beatitude achieved by the saints, their eternal rest, is just temporary.
It's just one stop on the Ferris wheel.
Exactly. They would be condemned to an inevitable circuit of returning to misery, suffering, and having to re-earn salvation over and over. It fundamentally violates the promise of eternal rest. It eliminates hope. It traps humanity in a never-ending labyrinth.
And his counter-argument.
It's definitive. Christ died once, Semo. That sacrifice is singular, perfect, and non-repeatable. And because of that single irreversible act, the blessed souls achieve a final, eternal rest, and they will never return to misery. The Christian understanding of history is linear, purposeful, and moves toward a fixed, final goal, unlike the endless, hopeless cycle of the Stoics.
And finally, he completes the destiny of the city of God by affirming the resurrection of the body, a concept that so many of the worldly wise philosophers just rejected out of hand.
Many sophisticated Platonists, like Porphyry, who wrote extensive critiques of Christianity, believed that true happiness required the complete separation of the soul from all matter. The body was a prison, a burden. They sought eternal purity in the mind alone.
But Augustine insists on the resurrection of the flesh.
Because the body is an integral part of human nature. God did not create man as a soul merely inhabiting a temporary vessel. The final, glorified body will be incorruptible, spiritual, and perfectly obedient to the soul, a complete reversal of the effects of the fall. This is the difference between Christian hope and philosophical speculation. The ultimate destiny isn't disembodied intellectual thought, but the perfected, complete human being, soul and body, reunited in glory.
We've charted this incredible journey from literally door gods to the final judgment. So now we have to ask the final question. How does this dense 1,600-year-old theological system offer any practical wisdom for us, navigating a world that seems infinitely more complex than 5th century Rome?
I think the strongest, most persistent application of Augustinian wisdom lies in that distinction between the two loves and his concept of the shared lot of humanity. We still struggle so much with the idea that the world is fair or that success signals morality.
We absolutely do. We tend to judge people's goodness based on their temporal circumstances, their wealth, their health, their perceived lack of struggle.
And Augustine just constantly reminds us, God makes the sun rise on the good and the wicked. Prosperity, suffering, disease, technological advance. These temporal outcomes are common to both citizens of the city of God and the city of man.
So the success of a person or a company or even a nation is not a sign of divine favor.
Not at all. It's an act of providence that serves a deeper, often mysterious, eternal purpose.
So the true difference isn't what we suffer or what we're given, but how we use it, or how we suffer through it.
This is the critical takeaway, and he makes it famous with his striking analogies. He explains that the same external event, the same affliction, produces completely different results based on the nature of the sufferer.
Give us those powerful images again.
First, there's the fire. Augustine says, the same flame makes gold shine and straw smoke. Adversity is the fire.
Yeah.
If you are straw, if your foundation is the love of self, that fire consumes you. It produces only bitterness and protest against God.
But if you're gold...
If your foundation is the love of God, that same fire purifies you.
Yeah.
It reveals your true luster. The fire doesn't change the substance. It reveals what was already there.
That completely reframes every difficulty we face. It's an opportunity for revelation, not just arbitrary suffering.
And he adds another one. The same pressure, the same disturbance works differently depending on what's being stirred. He says the same pressure causes the mud to exude a horrible stench, but it causes the perfume to release a sweet aroma. And he warns that this affliction is necessary, because even the righteous can fall into a lazy indifference and fatal dissimulation. They can start fearing temporary loss or damage to their reputation and fail to confront iniquity in their own community.
That lazy indifference is a fascinating idea. It suggests that just avoiding major crimes isn't enough to secure your citizenship in the heavenly city.
Not at all. Augustine really chastises those who are too comfortable. He implies that if the righteous fear temporary suffering so much that they fail to offer the salutary bitterness of a necessary correction to their wicked neighbors, then they themselves will be justly punished by those temporal difficulties. The affliction acts as a discipline, shaking them out of their complacency.
Forcing them back to active, courageous moral engagement.
Exactly.
So in summary, Augustine provided this profound replacement narrative for a civilization that was literally in collapse. He systematically argued that the city of man, founded on pride and superstition and moral compromise, was just inherently destined for ruin, regardless of its walls or its economy.
And he replaced that with the singular, eternal vision centered on the true God. He defined the human struggle as a profound internal failure pride as the deficient cause of sin, which resulted in the body's revolt, in libido.
And this struggle plays out on the stage of human history as the confused mingling of the two cities, governed always by an unchanging providence.
Yes. And he assured his reeling audience that their true citizenship was untouched by catastrophe because the goal's eternal rest is singular, guaranteed, and irreversible, defeating the hopelessness of that cyclical pagan fate.
It gave confidence to pilgrims who felt lost in the ruins of the earthly city.
It reminded them to fix their gaze on the destination, not the path.
And so here is a final provocative thought for you to carry forward based on Augustine's profound analysis of spiritual choice and malice. Augustine argues that the nature of all created beings, even the demons, is fundamentally good, because God only creates good things. Therefore, the eternal misery of the demons is not dictated by their nature, but solely by their profunda malitia, their deep, irreversible malice, which is the ultimate expression of their free will. So if God created all things fundamentally good, then is the most terrifying implication of Augustine's work the profound, eternal, and self-inflicted power granted to choice, a choice that allows for a spiritual corruption more permanent than any natural disaster or physical death.
That truly highlights the immense responsibility inherent in our own will and the gravity of Augustine's concept of turning away from the immutable good. That is where we leave the two cities today.
Until next time, keep diving deep.